Today we're visiting the Artemas Ward house. Though really, we're visiting a memory cabinet.
It's a house that was created in 1763 as the dwelling of a man named Artemas Ward. But then many years later, in 1925, it became a museum, a public patriotic museum in memory of General Ward.
And it was turned into a museum by this man, who also happens to be named Artemas Ward.
There were a lot of them.
He was Artemas Ward of the 7th generation, and he was very proud of his ancestor. And so in 1925, he decided to give this house to Harvard University to create a public patriotic museum.
This was a period going from, the 1880s to the 1930s that we sometimes called the colonial revival. A period where anybody who had a historic house sort of wanted to imagine that George Washington had slept there. This family couldn't document anything quite that grandiose, but they had a really interesting story. Their ancestor, Artemas Ward, had been a militia commander in Massachusetts, and when the Revolution broke out in 1775, after the fight at Lexington and Concord, he took command of the New England troops and kept that command until Congress appointed George Washington to come to Cambridge and take over. So he did play a significant role in the American Revolution, but a very short role. And Artemas Ward of the 7th generation feared his ancestors' memory had been lost.
Right, because not only had he served as a general, he also went on to serve in the Third Continental Congress. In fact, at that moment, that was when this painting was created.
Yeah.
And so he had quite an illustrious history, even though he might not be someone you always read about in the history books. And Artemas Ward of the 7th generation wanted to make sure people remembered him.
People had lived here for 7 generations, and they had accumulated many, many things.
This space didn't necessarily start off as General Ward's bedroom, but it's been interpreted that way because it gives the Artemas Ward house the opportunity to display many objects associated with the general's person in one place. So originally this was a dairy room,
Right.
but now it's a bedroom space.
Right. And the artifacts are very, very interesting.
Evocative.
The cape, or what is commonly called a cardinal in the 18th century, is an outer garment, very warm, outdoor clothing. It sort of came to light at the time when the family was commissioning a statue of General Ward to be in Washington, D.C. And the photograph over here shows the artist's model. And clearly he used the cape in order to imagine the general in his 18th century clothing.
And if you've been to D.C., maybe you've seen it at Ward Circle. That's where this statue is. Another way the family is memorializing, remembering, making sure that we remember this illustrious ancestor.
This is a very, very precious object. It's a tricorn hat, probably not worn by General Ward, but by his son, who was a young man at the time of the Revolution. And it has this great rosette.
My favorite part of this object is this little button, this Civil War button, which is affixed to this 18th century Revolutionary era hat in order to tie the memory of these two conflicts together. And to me, that just makes it such an evocative object, that we have this layering, the same kind of layering we have throughout the Ward house, layering one historical event onto another.
Layering on the other. Wow, here's a relic, if I ever saw one.
Yeah. So we're looking at basically a Civil War flag or a Civil War guidon. And this object, like many objects in the house, remind us of all of the men from the Ward family who served. And I believe 73 of his descendants served.
Whoa.
So a huge number of Ward men were involved in the Civil War.
Good grief.
And their memories are kept here too. I mean, their memory is a big part of this house, just as the general's memory.
Of course, because they're carrying on the tradition.
They're carrying on that legacy of service, of
Right.
serving the country. And in some cases, I mean, we have one who gave his life for the country.
So this Charles, is it Charles Grosvenor?
Charles Grosvenor Ward.
Yeah.
And what's so poignant about this is that this Bible is memorializing him, but in fact, the only inscription that we have here reads this thus on the marriage page. Let no marriage ever be recorded here.
Oh.
He whose memory is embalmed in this sacred book gave himself to his country, and for his life gave up his own.
It's such a sort of classic 19th century sentimentalizing of both death and the marriage that never happened.
Right,
And,
exactly.
you know, in the 19th century, you're allowed to weep. Weeping is good. Weeping shows sensibility. And the memory and the flag itself. I mean,
Right.
one of the things that makes the flag so poignant is it's so
It's
just
in tatters.
ragged.
It's in tatters.
It's in tatters. This
Right.
is something that once was that is no more,
Right.
like the lives of these soldiers.
These men.
So over in this corner is another little memorial to Charles Grosvenor Ward. At some point after his death, the family gathered with a professional photographer to take a picture. And it's really sort of fascinating. This is not just a picture of the family.
It's not a typical family portrait.
No, it's not at all. It's a picture of the house. And then the people connected to the house sort of spread out on the lawn with the stone wall. And you're looking back at the house. And Charles is there symbolically because in the front of the house is his horse.
His horse, which was sent back after he died.
Yes, the very horse that he had ridden during the war had been returned by the government with its blankets and saddlebags, and it became a kind of living memorial to the son who was lost.
This memory cabinet is a corner cupboard that was added to the house sometime in the 20th century. There was a corner cupboard here in the 18th century, but in the 19th century it was replaced with a more modern series of shelves.
Very Victorian looking.
Exactly. So they decided to install one, even though no 18th century corner cupboard ever looked like this. But if we look inside, we see many objects associated with 18th century members of the Ward family.
The family had this legend that during the 7 Years' War, or what we usually call the French and Indian War, General Ward was there with the militia from his county, and they claimed that he took this epaulette from, I guess, the body of a French soldier. This was a fight between the English and the French, and brought it home as a souvenir. What do you think about that story?
Well, we don't really know if it's true because looking at this object, we don't know if it's British, we don't quite know if it's French or American, we don't quite know what it is. And then this object,
Oh, it's one
Which
of
is
my
very
favorites as
fragile.
well.
And
Aunt Patty.
Aunt Patty's bowl. And we'll just take
Yeah.
a moment to read what it says inside. There's a wonderful little paper label, labels that are throughout the house. And it says, bright figured bowl, belonged to Martha Ward, born December 19th, 1724, died July 2nd, 1794, daughter of Name Ward, and sister of General Artemas Ward. So even Aunt Patty's bowl
Is connected to Artemas
connected to
because
Artemas.
he is the focal point of the Public Patriotic Museum as it was created in the 1920s. It looks to me like this is damaged. Has
Yes,
this been broken and then
it's been
pieced
broken
back
and
together?
carefully pieced back together.
So it was so meaningful because it had took people back in time to a period that they didn't want to forget.
All of the memory work that the Ward family was doing to present the story of General Artemas Ward, many stories were inevitably left out, including many stories that we as historians would like to address today.
One of the interesting stories is about who did the work in this family. It was a big working farm. And there's a fascinating little document here, an embroidered sampler, typical to the kind of thing done in the early 19th century by young girls. So it has an alphabet and numbers, and then it gives us her name, Sarah H. Ward, 1811.
When she was 10 years old.
But it's the picture that's fascinating. Yeah. Often these little samplers will have sheep or a courting couple.
Right.
And she chose something else. So over on this side of the house is a man holding a very large farm rake. And on this side, another person, a smaller person, working the water pump. And what's interesting is how she distinguished very, very strongly between these two figures. This is a white man. This is a person of color.
Right, totally different threads.
And we know from the local history as well as from the U.S. Census of 1810, this was a house full of kids. I think there were about 8 children in the house by that time. And there were also a number of unrelated persons who were servants or farm laborers. And among them was a person of color between the ages of 10 and 15.
So quite close in age to Sarah when she's making this.
Right. And some of the local family history tells us that the Wards had a servant named William Jackson who was African American.
And so perhaps that's her way of representing William Jackson there at the pump.
Yeah.
Artemas Ward of the 7th generation may have given the Artemas Ward house to Harvard and bequeathed money with it so it could continue as a museum. But in fact, it was the Ward women who maintained this place, who were the real memory keepers.
And here are some of them. We have 3 sisters. The oldest sister, Ellen, married and left home. But Bessie, or Elizabeth, and Hattie, or Harriet, stayed in the house.
In fact, they were the last people to live here when they died in 1900 and 1909, actually living in the house.
So they were literally the keepers of the house, and then the keepers of all the accumulated memories, all the stories they had inherited from their ancestors, and that I think they love to tell over and over again.
Well, Elizabeth, she wrote a book, Old Times in Shrewsbury, telling these stories, publishing them for others. And Hattie, she's the one who started labeling all of these objects, actually writing paper labels on them so that we can read them and say, this is how this object relates to General Ward.
And then they had a niece, Ella, who's in this picture as a grown-up. But she was represented in this quilt here. It's a sort of conventional, kind of straightforward, patched quilt. But what's remarkable is this little memorial in the center. If you can see the star, maybe stitched sometime later in the center, and in very neat handwriting explains that this quilt was begun when Ella was 4 years old.
And finished when she was 5 and a half. If you can believe it.
And you could sort of imagine her with her aunts, Bessie and Hattie, stitching those hand stitches, patch after patch after patch, a year and a half. But she had good eyes.
Diligent little girl.
And then I think she won a prize, actually, in the fair for having done this at a very young age.
So Ella and her 2 sisters and her aunts maintained these objects, labeled things. 2 of those Ward women became librarians.
And they became local historians in a very real way, especially Elizabeth, who didn't just write about her own family and her own house, but about Shrewsbury and the town of Shrewsbury. So it was that foundation and probably their close relationship with Artemas Ward of the 7th generation, who didn't grow up here, but would come in the summer and fell in love with the house. My favorite object in the house, I hate to confess it, is found in the bottom of one of the closets. And here is a pile of broken dishes and this amazing label, which reads,
"To be soaked apart and put together by someone who has more patience than Harriet Ward." An object that reminds us just how hard this work in memory keeping could be. Because of course, if this plate were soaked apart and put together, you would see no trace of that work. That's what a good memory maker does. You don't see the labor that goes into creating it.
And it's pieces of the past, fragments of the past, bits of oral tradition, artifacts, documents that they piece together so patiently.
And by looking closely, we can trace some of those fissures and cracks, and we can begin to understand that history in a much deeper way, beyond just the memory.